Okay, good afternoon. Thank you very much for powering through the first day of DevOps UK and making it through to one of the later sessions of the day. I'm here to talk about the Internet of Things and open source. Now, the very first thing to mention to you, since you've come into room 3, is that you may have noticed on the schedule that there are two of me here today. The Devoxians page puts us next to one another and, of course, highlights my deficiency, which is that I don't have a PhD. So I just want to make it clear that I am not the doctor. If you were expecting to hear from the doctor, then you should go into room 4. Okay. By the way, Andy and I have shaken hands before. The world hasn't imploded. We are quite safe. Those of you who are Doctor Who fans, the Blinovich limitation effect, no problems at all. So who am I and why am I here? Well, as you can tell from my T-shirt, I work for Twitter. I've been working for Twitter for a couple of months now. Really excited to be developer advocate there. But more importantly for the topic of this talk, I'm one of the leads on the Eclipse Paho project, which I'll talk a little bit about today. I've been working on the MQTT community for about 5 or 6 years since I was at IBM. If you've seen me before, you'll know that I get very excited about little bits of technology of any kind. And I was really privileged a couple of weeks ago to be at the O'Reilly Solid Internet of Things conference in San Francisco, which was extremely exciting and a really interesting new event series from O'Reilly. So that just kind of sets the scene a little bit to explain to you that although I'm a Twitter guy, hopefully I have a little bit of credentials in terms of talking about the Internet of Things. So the Internet of Things, it's an exciting time. Apparently this thing's going to take off. Just like every year since, about 1997 has been the year of Linux on the desktop, 2014 is the year of the Internet of Things. We're all going to be connected, everything's going to be connected, and actually for the past few years, we've all been saying, this thing's about to take off and go huge. But when we see things like Apple coming out with new APIs in iOS, like HomeKit, Google making another attempt in acquiring Nest, there are clear signs that this stuff is getting much more important and much bigger. And all of that means that there's going to be a lot of work for us as developers to do, both in terms of building applications that consume data and generate data, and simply to connect and integrate systems. So, capsule summary of where we're going this afternoon. I'm going to start off by talking about openness, open source and open standards, and why I strongly believe in them. Although I'm the man with a Mac at the front here, we'll come to Apple bashing later, perhaps. Then we'll talk a little bit about the Internet of Things itself and some of the interesting challenges in that space. And finally, talk about some projects and protocols that are important in that space, in case you're not aware of them already. A couple of things. My Twitter handle in the corner here on every slide, if you want to tweet about me, and Andy Piper, that's my actual name, seemed to work as a Twitter handle for some reason. And there's a hashtag for the session on the corner there, Eclipse IoT, which may give you a hint as to which direction this talk will be going. So, open wins. And I don't think that's a particularly controversial statement. If Tim Berners-Lee had taken his thing called the World Wide Web to some Silicon Valley startup and commercialized it, it's pretty unlikely it would have got to where it is today in terms of enabling people to connect online so easily. And of course, a couple of companies we may remember from the early days of the internet, and dial-up connections and those wonderful CDs we got with every single magazine or piece of junk mail from CompuServe or AOL or whoever else existed in the UK. Those guys aren't around anymore. Or if they are, they're very, very different shape to what they were, because their attempt to build kind of a closed online network didn't work very well. And obviously, there's another network around that Stephen Fry commented on a couple of years ago at the OggCamp event. He spoke to us on a video at OggCamp. OggCamp's awesome, by the way. You should go. There's another one coming up this year. It's an unconference around open source technology. And he actually said, at the time, Facebook is just AOL dressed up for the modern world, which in some ways you can kind of see some similarities with. As I said, that was a couple of years ago. But of course, The truth is that openness really does win. When in 1991 Linus Torvalds posted online in a mailing list, these days you might imagine he might have tweeted this kind of thing, hey guys, I've got this little project. Everybody who's interested in Minix, you might like it. I'm summarizing here. It's not going to be anything big and professional, but of course Linux these days is everywhere. Linux is in your home router. It's the kind of inspiration behind a lot of Android, and it's in many, many devices. Why is that? Because it's open source. And the fact that it's open source means that it's been very rapidly adapted to new hardware platforms as they've come along. So it runs on everything from massive symmetric multiprocessing machines, the IBM mainframe, and all kinds of new chips. So Linux has been hugely successful. And of course, the Apache HTTP server is still, and I checked this today, still the default server that runs the internet. This is literally from w3text.com today. There are a whole bunch of other servers that it lists that are below the 0.1% level. Even things like Node.js are still probably fronted in this case by Nginx or Apache. So the open source options are the default options. And those are the things that run the internet today. Most of the proprietary ones on there, other than Microsoft, you could kind of claim is a bit of a rounding error. And again, in fact, things like IBM WebSphere or whatever is likely to be fronted by some open source software like HTTPD. So this open source thing works, right? And when I left university and started working in technology a number of years ago, there was a lot of suspicion about open source. In fact, that was in 1997, and Linux was still in its absolute infancy. You had to install it from lots of floppy disks, and it was a complete nightmare to use. But suddenly, 20 years later, nearly 20 years later, we're in a world where this stuff is just accepted. And I suggest to you that this is really important as a consideration as we build out the infrastructure for the next generation of the internet and the Internet of Things. This kind of idea of stovepipes and silos is extremely dangerous in terms of protecting our freedoms as internet citizens. Now, openness extends to standards and protocols and APIs as well. We probably all remember the web services standards and grew to love them if we worked for IBM, as I did for 10 years. But really nobody's using that stuff, right? I mean, Twitter's API is simple JSON over HTTP. We have an API that we call the REST API. Of course, if you look at it, it's more or less REST-like. We don't always follow conventions like put and delete and other things that you might find in a true REST system, but the point is that we are simply using the very, very common pattern of JSON over HTTP. And so do many other online services. So really, what we've seen over the last 5 to 10 years around online APIs is that developers have voted with their feet. Openness and simplicity have won. And again, that has driven the adoption of these protocols. So why are developers important? Well, most of us here are probably a developer in some shape or form. Developers build cool things. And having a developer community around a new technology is going to drive excitement and adoption for it. We've only got to look at the excitement, some may say crazy excitement, around a technology like Docker, which over the last week or so has drawn lots of people to San Francisco. Although, what's so new about it? We've had containerization in operating systems for a long time. Well, they've got an amazing developer community. People are very excited, and they're taking it in new directions. So we want to build a developer community around any technology. And of course, developers drive innovation. Developers build cool stuff, they see cool stuff, they tell their friends about cool stuff, and when that stuff is open source and easy to use, becomes a self-fulfilling community. So it's quite a simple equation, really. We take open technology, open source and open standards, and developers discover it, and they get excited about it, and then all of a sudden they start to do really cool things. And again, as someone who works at Twitter, you can see a lot of the things that Twitter has done over the years over the 8 years of its life have been driven by the ways that developers and users started to use the platform and the API. And that's one of the things I'm excited about as a developer advocate for Twitter today. If you want to read more about this kind of stuff, there's this great book by my friend Steve O'Grady from RedMonk, talking about developers as the new kingmakers, the idea that we now have the power as developers to, as those of you who were in my colleague Chris's talk before, we have the power and the democratization around technology that says, I can come up with a cool idea, rent some cloud processing power, push my idea out there, and suddenly I've got the next Instagram or other runaway hit on my hands. And that's what Steve is talking about when he talks about developers as the new kingmakers. Developers actually have the power to make a technology successful and make themselves successful too. So, that's my section on openness. Let's talk about the Internet of Things then. And I'm not going to go through 14 different definitions of the Internet of Things. If that's what you were expecting, there are lots of talks around. I gave a talk back in December at an event called ThingMonk in London. Really cool conference run by RedMonk at the Shoreditch Village Hall. And I suggested at that talk that the Internet of Things is made of signals. And I'll talk a little bit more about what I mean by that. If you're interested in actually digging into that talk, the slides are on SlideShare with presenter notes, and there's a video of me presenting it as well. The Internet of Things, I continue to say, is about signals, but it's actually a lot more than that. The Internet itself is made of people. The reason that the Internet exists and is useful and important to us is because we are humans. Humans are natively social. We like to communicate. We like to share information. And we want to be connected to our friends and, in fact, to new information and knowledge. So the Internet is about people. And when you sprinkle in objects and web services and applications and sensors, we start to redefine the way the Internet looks, and we start to come to what we mean by the Internet of Things. All of those objects, all of those items, domain objects, if you like, on this chart, are things that emit data. Now let's think about that for a moment. Tim Berners-Lee invented the World Wide Web, and what he did was he put a web server in CERN, and he let people connect to it and get documents. So the web, the common internet that we understand today, is a request-response-based system that was built for getting a document from a web server into a web browser. And we spent the last 15 years twisting HTTP and bending it and breaking it and doing all kinds of funky things and making, AJAX requests and layering web services on top of it. But fundamentally, web services, remote procedure call, it's a request-response system. So we put HTTP on top of that emerging sort of 1980s, 1990s TCP/IP standard. Once Microsoft started using it as well, that kind of drove the whole ecosystem. And we put HTTP over the top, and we got some documents into our web browsers. Yay us. We're awesome. Unfortunately, that may not make HTTP as a protocol particularly good for the Internet of Signals and the Internet of broadcast messaging, because signals are really more like an emit and respond when appropriate model. We're not necessarily always going to expect a response. A sensor doesn't necessarily need to get any kind of response from anyone. All its job is to tell you what the temperature is, or what the light level is, or what the air quality is. It doesn't need to have a response, or doesn't need to do that in a synchronous manner. So particularly when we think about how we scale an internet of connected objects that are constantly emitting data, request response is probably not a great model. Something I tweeted about recently, there was a bit of a debate online about the various protocols out there in the Internet of Things. Fundamentally, there are lots of them, and they're not going away. There is no one single answer to this problem. There is no one protocol to rule them all. The Internet of Things is going to have lots of protocols as lots of different people come along and want to connect their devices. And what we're going to have is the need for developers like us to connect with them easily and quickly and integrate systems quickly. So, with that in mind, let's move on to thinking about some of those protocols and some of those projects. I'm going to illustrate the points I've just made around openness and protocols and the Internet of Things with a story of one of the projects I'm involved with, which is the Eclipse Paho project in MQTT. But I'm certainly not going to ignore other things out there, and we'll come to those as we go through. So let's start off with this story of a little community and a little protocol that once upon a time some guys at IBM and another company invented. And it's called this thing called MQTT. It's a publish and subscribe messaging standard, a messaging protocol. It's not a new thing. People keep tweeting or posting blogs and saying, oh, I've discovered this amazing new protocol. Is this thing called MQTT? Well, actually, it's not new. Okay, so a little bit about the history of this thing. It was invented in 1999 by Dr. Andy Stanford Clark from IBM and Arlen Nipper from a company at the time called Arcom. And they were doing it because they had a problem. They were working on oil fields and flood level monitoring systems, and they were very typically using a protocol called SCADA, or SCADA, Supervisory Control and Data Acquisition, which was really kind of a closed protocol. It was almost like a closed loop protocol. So they wanted to help that to scale better, and they also wanted an open or more open protocol that they could plug into IBM applications. So back in 1999, this thing got invented. IBM implemented it in their products, but nobody else was really using it. Maybe Arcom and the company that bought them, Eurotech, were using it as well. So suddenly, if we start to look at the Internet of Things, this thing has become popular. Let's have a little look back at the history of this. And I love this because I'm a historian, as it happens. That conference I mentioned earlier, OggCamp, that Stephen Fry was at, or spoke at a couple of years ago, 2009 was the very first OggCamp, and that is Dr. Andy Stanford Clark. He's awesome. He was my mentor when I was at IBM, and he likes to talk about his connected home. So he has the most amazing automated house. It's on the Isle of Wight, and he does a lot of traveling, so he's often away from his home. So he likes to know things like, when the phone rings, who's calling, or have I left the gate open? He can switch on and off his lights remotely with his system. The other interesting story that Andy often tells is that he has a mouse problem. It's a farmhouse on the Isle of Wight, and they have mice in the loft. And he found that very maintenance intensive, having to go up into the loft and collect the dead mice and reopen the mouse traps, because the only way that a mouse trap is useful is if it's waiting for a mouse and it's got fresh cheese in it. So Andy, being a good engineer and a total propellerhead geek like myself, decided to throw a load of technology at this problem. And he thought, well, I've invented this thing called MQTT, and it's lightweight and simple and works with small devices. So I'm going to instrument my home, and he drives his entire home on this basis. A little bit more about the mice, by the way. It's really awesome. He's got these mouse traps that he has connected to some Arduinos and knows when they've closed and caught a mouse. So he knows when to send his son up into the loft with some body bags to pick up the mice. When a mousetrap closes, it fires a mouse event, geek joke, and he then discovered that these mice on the Isle of Wight are very picky, because it turns out that they only like fresh cheese. If the cheese has been sitting there for a few days, it's gone a bit hard. No mice. That's no good at all. So Andy decided to instrument his cheese. He actually put electrodes into the cheese, and as the cheese hardens, it increases the resistance between the electrodes, and he gets another cheese event. Anyway, I digress massively. Andy spoke about his automated home at this OggCamp event. So this was 10 years after the protocol had been invented and was being used by him for his home. And you can see him talk about it on BBC news reports and things as well, by the way. At the time, it had been released as a royalty-free specification by IBM. And it was slowly being discovered by some members of the open source community like myself and some of my colleagues, but then, of course, I would have done because I worked with him. So he gave this talk at OggCamp, and this chap called Roger Light, who's amazing, that evening, as you can see the first timestamp from Mercurial, went home and wrote a message broker based on this protocol, Mosquito, the very first open source message broker for MQTT, because previously IBM had a closed source product called Message Broker, which cost a lot of money. And then they also released a little binary-only message broker called the really small message broker. Lots of people in the open source community want to hack on things and want to pull things apart, and that wasn't quite enough. So Roger decided, well, this thing is royalty-free. Okay, it's not an open standard right now, but nobody's going to come after me. And that night he built the first broker. And that broker, Mosquito, is now used in many, many places, and I'll show you in particular where it is in a moment. So that was 2009 to 2010. The second OggCamp was in 2010. By the third OggCamp in 2011, where I spoke about what had happened to this community that I was helping to evolve and shepherd along, by that time we had a number of different client APIs, different languages, Java, C, starting to get into things like Python, Perl as well. And we also started to get onto some devices like the Arduino, the Mbed, some of the small prototyping boards. The specification was republished royalty-free with some clarifications in 2010. We started to open it up. We said we're going to take this thing to a standards body. I say we, I was at IBM at the time. And then actually, on the night before the third OggCamp, I was in a pub with Laura and some other people, and Facebook randomly blogged about the fact that they discovered this amazing, space-age satellite protocol called MQTT, which they decided was really cool because it was very lightweight. Therefore, it meant it was very low power on mobile devices and very fast. And so they actually adopted it and started using it in Facebook Messenger. All of a sudden, you've got a footprint of millions of mobile devices running this protocol and a company like Facebook who are running this thing at scale. Where are we now? Well, I've actually lost count of the number of different language clients for this thing. We've got Lua, we've got probably Haskell out there somewhere, some really obscure things, certainly Clojure, Erlang, all those kind of more common languages as well, more interesting ones. We've got both new commercial brokers. We've got a company out of Germany called DC Squared, who've got a commercial broker called HiveMQ, which is going great. IBM's released an appliance with this thing on, but there's also a load more open source brokers, which is great, lots of choice for developers. The thing is now standardized. We are weeks away from Oasis publishing the first official, fully open standard that's been contributed to by about 20 or 30 different companies. We've got a number of projects in Eclipse IoT, which I'll talk to in a moment. And really importantly, from my perspective, the project that I'm co-leading, Eclipse Paho, which contains a number of different clients in different languages for MQTT, is graduating. So we've been in incubation at Eclipse for a couple of years. And when Eclipse Luna is released in 10 days' time, we are graduating. We will be 1.0, and you will be able to get a really solid MQTT implementation from us. You can get one now, by the way. It's just not 1.0. It's just a number, one of those little rounding errors. So, the Internet of Things is about interoperability. This is actually from the Oasis MQTT Technical Committee. The latest version of the standard is broadly backwards compatible with all of the things that have gone before. And once again, open source works. That whole story about how this little protocol that was this thing that was barely used outside of IBM and a couple of industries 15 years ago is kind of taking the Internet of Things world by storm. It's not the only protocol out there at all, and I'll talk about some others in just a moment. So around 2011, and that was just around the time I was about to leave IBM, the core IBM technology got donated to Eclipse. Now Eclipse, as we all, at a Java developer conference, we all know and love Eclipse, or we all know and love IntelliJ, depending on our favorite editor. But Eclipse is a lot more than just the IDE. I actually joined IBM about a month after they made their famous $40 million donation of their code that set up the Eclipse Foundation and started off the IDE. But these days, Eclipse has a lot more than just the IDE. It has a number of collaborative working groups, including an IoT working group where we have regular calls and work out where we need to go next in terms of standards and technology, and a broad community of projects. So the IDE in tools obviously is where it all started, but if you look at the way that the Eclipse Foundation is laid out, we have core technology projects for things like Java runtimes, as well as now an IoT project. So it started off as something we called M2M at Eclipse, so machine-to-machine messaging and machine-to-machine technologies. Over the last couple of years, since we formed that working group, We've evolved, and we've become now the IoT group at Eclipse. So that was a working group. There's a website, iot.eclipse.org. And more importantly, we're just about to have the first top-level project. So if you're familiar with the way the Eclipse Foundation is set up, that will actually enable us to move all of the IoT-related runtimes and tools into their own top-level project at Eclipse. We've got other things at iot.eclipse.org. We've got a load of sandboxes and demonstrators. This picture is very, very dark, but this is a little automated greenhouse that runs using MQTT and WebSockets and a BeagleBone Black, so you can measure the temperature and all that kind of thing. It's really just a simple demonstrator to show, with a bunch of inexpensive hardware and a load of free software from Eclipse, you can actually start to do this kind of automation. Now, of course, this kind of simple level stuff is not where we're aiming. We're aiming at things like the broad industry adoption that we've already seen from the Eclipse IDE. Companies are very, very comfortable with the Eclipse public license. They're very, very comfortable with the quality of code that comes from the Eclipse community and the regular annual releases that come out from Eclipse now. So we definitely want to be in that space with all of the Internet of Things technologies. So at Eclipse, we think of the Internet of Things in a number of dimensions. We start off with the protocols, which I started to tell you about with MQTT. We also have some tools, because it's important we want to be able to build and connect up devices and protocols. We have frameworks so that we can adapt to whatever runtime we need to use. And then we have some additional services, so things like brokers to actually let you connect up your devices. So back in 2011, we started with just 3 projects. It was just this, like I said, it was kind of like the little working group that could. We started off with these 3 core projects, and they were really, really different. Paho is a collection of clients for MQTT, no broker. Paho, MQTT is a hub-spoke, if you like, broker model, publish and subscribe. So you need a broker, but we didn't have one. Then we had something called Konecki, which is a set of Lua tooling for the IDE. What the heck? What's that got to do with MQTT or protocols or the Internet of Things? Well, Lua, because it's an embeddable scripting language, is actually very, very popular in this space because it compiles down to C and can run on embedded systems. And then we had this framework called Mahini, which enabled you to kind of piece together some of the pieces, the frameworks that we needed to run. Well, again, let's fast forward. This open source community and the enthusiasm and some of the things that are going on in the Internet of Things has led that whole thing to blossom. We've now got 14 projects as part of the Eclipse IoT community and ecosystem. What this means is you've got lots of different ways to get involved and lots of different angles. So if you're interested in, hey, I actually want to use CoAP instead of MQTT, well, we've got the Californian project, which is that CF at the top. We've got some great names here as well. Wakama, that's just amazing. I have no idea what it means. A lot of these names are actually Maori words, and they do have some kind of meaning, but I don't speak Maori, so. We've got a couple of MQTT brokers over there now. And interestingly, from a Java perspective, we've got a couple of Java runtimes, including Concierge, which is the smallest, aiming to be the smallest OSGI runtime that you can actually run anywhere. It's really tiny. And we've got a full kind of smart home framework. So if you wanted to start, in a similar way to Apple HomeKit, if you wanted to start instrumenting your home and connecting things in, you can do so using Eclipse Smart Home. But I really want to highlight one of these projects, because if we go back to that tweet I posted, I showed you earlier, I mentioned that the Internet of Things has lots of different protocols. And if you follow me or follow the conversation around the Internet of Things on Twitter or on forums, you'll see that there's a lot of fun conversations that happen. My protocol is better than yours. My protocol is more appropriate for this or that or the other than yours. Fine. Peace, I agree. There are lots of protocols, and many of them are useful in different contexts. Ponte, Eclipse Ponte, Ponte being the Italian for bridge, written by a nice Italian gentleman in Node.js, by the way. Eclipse is not just all about Java anymore, if it ever has been. Ponte's goal is to actually form a bridge between all these different protocols and enable you to connect your different devices and different applications together. It's got lots of different backing stores. Again, he's not saying, well, I will only use this one broker or this one database. I want to actually adapt to any set of requirements. So right now, It supports CoAP MQTT and HTTP, RESTful HTTP, and in the future we're looking to add other protocols as well. This is not all about software. Another reason that this is a really interesting space, particularly now, is because hardware, whether it's open or whether it's more just affordable, Raspberry Pi is really an affordable piece of kit rather than something that's fully open source. Really all of this started with Arduino, and that platform has created this amazing ecosystem of Arduino-likes, if you like, PCduino and Esperuino and all kinds of others are out there. Low-cost hardware prototyping platforms that you can either use yourselves to build your own smart home or whatever you might want to do, or you can actually use as the basis for building something commercial. And that's why if you go on Kickstarter pretty much any day of the month and search for Arduino, you'll probably get about 5 or 6 different hardware projects saying they're going to be the next most awesome thing. So in the past, if you'd wanted to get into this Internet of Things or connected devices space, you would have had to invest a lot of money. You would have had to go and get a load of custom hardware. You would have had to get to know the operating system in a very intimate way, let's say. But nowadays, you can go and buy a few of these devices at a very inexpensive price point and start to combine it with a lot of this amazing open source software that's coming out. So this is a really exciting time to be getting into this space and adopting the open source way. However, just because we've got 14 projects at the Eclipse IoT group, and just because we can buy Arduinos and Raspberry Pis, the Internet of Things is not a done deal. We're really at the beginning of this whole space, and there are a lot of problems. The first one I've alluded to already, which is the siloization and desire of all these different companies coming into this space to build their own ecosystem. So I'm a massive fan of WeThings from France. They build smart monitors, health monitors. So I usually wear get my words right. I normally wear a pedometer. I use the scales at home. I have a blood pressure monitor as well. I actually have a heart condition, so when I discovered that, I started to check my health much more regularly. And they're great. They all work together in the same way that all the Apple stuff works together. Unfortunately, I would really like to get that data and mash it up with data from Fitbit, or I also wear an Up fitness band as well. And I'd like to compare the two because, you know, neither of them are going to be fully accurate. But unfortunately, they don't really want you to get at that data. They like to have a closed ecosystem. A few of them have some small APIs around the edges, but right now there's no kind of open way of dealing with that data. So siloization is a problem. Certainly at Eclipse, we want to embrace a number of other protocols as part of this space. Some of the ones that typically get thrown around in those my protocol is better than yours arguments are things like XMPP and DDS. It'd be really interesting to see those guys or some of the open source projects in that space come over to Eclipse. Security is a classic problem that is always discussed. What if somebody can hack my fridge? Oh my goodness. All my food will go off, and what will happen? You know, that would be very sad. But no, I mean, more seriously, every time I have talked to journalists about this, they've always been keen, because they're journalists, to get me to say, oh yes, we're going to put all this data online, and you're going to be able to hack my home. Security is a problem, and security is a problem for small devices in particular, where you've got limited processing capabilities. So we definitely don't want to ignore this. Now, a friend of mine, Paul Fremantle from WSO2, has been doing some really interesting research work around how we combine things like the OAuth authentication model with some of the problems we have in the Internet of Things space, such as headless devices, unattended devices, things that need to run for a very long time on battery power, and so on. Data formats and semantics, everybody uses their own data format because, you know, my thing is better than your thing. And I like the way that I decided to write my database schema better than the way you did yours. My perspective on this is that we need to keep things simple, and we need to keep things straightforward, and we don't need to, in the classic phrase, boil the ocean, because simplicity is always best when you're trying to integrate lots of different systems. So there's a lot of work going on already around how, sort of ontologies, around how we define and describe objects, sensors, and other things like that. Discovery is an important problem as well. Not discovery in the UDDI sense of discovery, because that would make me cry. It certainly made me cry when I was having to deal with it back in the good old days. But the ability to actually self-discover devices, especially on smaller systems, it would be really interesting. And again, we'd need some kind of standard way to do that. So definitely not a done space. And oh my goodness, there's all this data. We've got all these devices pumping out the little signals and creating this massive cloud of data, which of course the NSA will happily comb through and find out what I was eating this morning. That's going to be useful to them. One of the things that we haven't really addressed is how we make useful sense of all of that data and combine it in interesting ways. There's a hell of a lot of data out there, and one of the things I'm excited about from an open source and developer perspective is the opportunity that we have to innovate and discover new ways of using that data. It's exactly the same thing that happened when Twitter came along and had an API, and people said, oh, that's amazing. What if we could, wait, we can mash this up and say, well, we can find out who's tweeting about what in this area. And suddenly you've got whole new applications for mapping crime data or mapping river levels and listening to tweets and so on. Developers always innovate, and developers often innovate better than the inventor of the technology in the first place. So I'm excited about this prospect, but it is an issue at the moment. Finally then, I hope I've persuaded you and encouraged you to think that openness is not an optional thing. It's the way to be successful, particularly as a software developer. We should definitely embrace the fact that there are all these people out there sharing code on places like GitHub. We should encourage them to include a license with the code they're sharing on GitHub, by the way. And we should enjoy the innovation that's coming from this kind of sharing. I hope I've also encouraged you to think about the fact that although we talk about the Internet of Things, it is not the web. It is not the same thing. We have some different problems. We have some similar problems, but we have some very different problems in the way that we address this new space. And the other exciting thing I'd like to really re-emphasize is that if you're really interested in getting involved in open source and the Internet of Things, come to Eclipse, take a look at iot.eclipse.org. It's going to get very exciting around the Eclipse Lunar release when some of the projects start to graduate. And we're really wanting to make Eclipse the home of open standards and open source in this space. So do come and join us. Because I want to see more developers building more awesome stuff all the time. I've got about 10 minutes left for questions, and I would love to take some if you have any for me. Thank you. Hi.
Do you think kind of classic smart home technology such as Zigbee still has any traction in the IoT world? Is that dead in the water?
Great, thanks. So classic IoT technology such as Zigbee. Well, do you want me to go on a rant about Zigbee, or no? Like I said, I think there are a lot of things out there, and they're not going away. So Zigbee and Z-Wave are very popular in certain cases. I think what we're going to see is we're going to see easier to integrate kind of local home hubs, which deal with more of those protocols. Zigbee in particular has got an issue, which is that it's not open, and it's extremely encumbered by lots of patents and other issues and licensing. But I don't see it going away. It's not something that I expect to suddenly come to Eclipse IoT, for example, because of the nature of that technology. But it's very popular still. Thanks. Hi.
Do you think that the Apple sort of HomeKit system is going to pull things forward, or do you think it's going to sort of close things down?
That's a great question. So what do I think about Apple HomeKit? Will it pull things forward or close things down? Really hard to say, because right now it's just an API, and I haven't had a chance to play with it or look at it in detail yet. I think it's a great idea in terms of having a single piece of glass from which to control things, and obviously if enough manufacturers sign up to it, then it may become a self-fulfilling prophecy. But Apple is only one platform, right? Android is arguably leading way ahead of the Apple ecosystem, and I don't expect Google to jump on that HomeKit bandwagon unless something very surprising happens at Google I/O. So I think it's great to see them adopting a stance that says we recognize that there is this Internet of Things and people do want easier access to device data and so on, in the same way that HealthKit is enabled, will let me take all my health tracking data and have it on a single piece of glass. But I don't have a huge amount of faith myself in Apple's long-term strategy. We'll have to see. Like I say, I think the most exciting part is that it's going to encourage people to start thinking about developing and integrating these kind of systems. Thanks. Any more for any more? Hi.
I'm not sure I'll be able to frame the question.
Okay.
With the Internet of Things, and if it is fitted with a bunch of home devices like fridge or television connected to Internet, the integration and the software that is running in that devices would be owned and developed by the manufacturer. If that is true, then where do you see developers playing in? Like with mobile apps, there was a lot of scope for developers to innovate and write stuff, because it was not dependent necessarily on some software that is just sitting in my fridge or sitting in my television.
So I think, let me try and frame that into a question for you. So there's a load of devices out there that have software on them, which is developed by the manufacturers. Therefore, why should third-party developers be interested and so on? Well, for me, the thing that I like about the Eclipse approach is that we are trying to develop an ecosystem of projects which those manufacturers themselves can pick up and use and be standards compliant and have the ability to connect out. So, for example, if let's imagine, and I don't think the connected TV and fridge story is particularly compelling, but let's go down that road. So let's imagine that my TV publishes MQTT messages about what program is currently showing, and my fridge publishes messages over MQTT about what food is in it at the moment. For example, ridiculous suggestion, but the fact that they're coming over that protocol and the manufacturer's chosen an Eclipse implementation, which is a solid one, means that developers can pick up and do other things with it. It doesn't mean that developers can come along and pull apart the TV and start putting apps on there. In fact, as we know, lots of TV manufacturers do have developer platforms these days because every company is a software company, right? Everyone needs software for their gadgets. So I think that's a slightly different story. I think the point I'm trying to make is we can do two things here. We can provide a foundational set of technologies, as Eclipse, the IDE, has for 48 other IDEs that are out there already today that are either commercial or also open source, but people have built on top of the fundamental Eclipse IDE. We can provide that foundational set of IoT technologies that manufacturers and third parties can adopt. And we as developers, through following those open standards and using that open source software and hoping and encouraging the companies to start to be more open, can start to innovate based on that data at the edges, at the endpoints. Does that make sense? Thanks. Does that make sense to everyone else? Or are you all sitting here thinking this guy's a nutcase? Which is fine, by the way. Yeah, he thinks I'm a nutcase. Awesome. When do I think it's going to happen? Look, I said it, we're at the beginning of this whole space, and it could be that a giant like Apple comes along and upsets the cart and people go down that road. I think from an Eclipse perspective, although we're 3 years in from when we made the initial code contributions, we are now graduating with 3 or 4 of those projects. The Mosquito broker has joined Eclipse, but it's already extremely heavily used. I don't know when that kind of tipping point that says, and all these manufacturers will integrate all of these things will be, but some of them already do. So you'll find that a number of manufacturers out there today are using, let's say, MQTT or maybe Eclipse Smart Home as the foundation of their systems, and that's great. But I don't have a timescale for you. I'm dodging that bullet. Hi.
I'm a technologist, and I love that story, the mousetrap. But I guess I'm also aware that life is quite complex.
Yeah.
I think my fear of Internet of Things is that Christ, everything's going to start bleeping at me and alerting me for various bits of stages. So I think for me, the aspiration of Internet of Things must still be simplicity. We don't want this to be
So the statement is, it would be great if we didn't have all of our things bleeping at us, and we need to aspire to simplicity. And I agree with you, and that's why I love services like If This Then That online, because they are simply letting you plug 2 things together, having control over those notifications or what you want to happen. There's a great podcast, the Giga Ohm. If you're interested in this space, GigaOM, the website, they do a podcast, GigaOM, my Internet of Things podcast, presented by my friend Stacey Higginbotham, and she's constantly talking about, hey, I've just moved house, and I just want, as I arrive at my garage door, I want it to unlock and open, and I want the lights to come on, and I want the bath to run, all that kind of stuff, that whole series of events, but I don't want to have to program it myself. I just like to kind of imagine it for it to all to happen. Somebody has to do some of that stuff, and I think, that's always what Apple's got right. Well, certainly for the last 10, 15 years, Apple's done well, is boiling down those experiences for users to something simple. It's great to see more companies following a similar path and realizing that end user experience is really important. I think user experience in the Internet of Things is as you were absolutely right, is a complex problem to solve. And there's some really interesting talks out there. My brain is blanking on the particular lady's name. No, it's gone. I will tweet it later if I can remember the specific person who does some great talks about exactly what you're describing. How do we keep the user experience simple, but embrace the fact that we'd like to be able to put all these things together in a useful way? Go on. That's fine. We've got another 2 or 3 minutes.
You're talking about the fact that obviously these systems are almost broadcasting. Whether anything picks them up or not doesn't really matter. Is the key to this?
The NSA is always picking them up, just so we're clear.
There's always at least one listener. So within that, is the answer, or is the space moving forward, the algorithms that sort of make use of that information? Because you're talking about the fact that if people have to sort of put all this information in and program it, it's going to become very arduous.
Yeah. That was kind of my data point at the end there, which is, we've got all this data, how do we make useful sense of it? So, sorry, I didn't mean to.
No, it's okay. So I just wondered whether or not if there's an ability to have something that learns from that, to be able to look at people and what they do and look at them through the sort of thing, is whether or not the thing that's going to push this forward from the killer application is when somebody comes up with an algorithm that says, okay, you don't have to do anything. I saw that last Tuesday you came back from work at 11:30 that was late because you had that meeting, therefore now I'm going to run you by and you get on that time.
Yeah, so how do we make sense of the data in a useful way, and is there a place here for AI, right? Well, I mean, the Nest Learning Thermostat already is adopting that pattern on a very small scale and solving one problem domain. But fundamentally, my friends, we are creating Skynet. Welcome to the future. Terminators will be along soon, and when we start talking about killer apps, that's what we're talking about, okay? Massive cyborgs. That's my answer. Cyberdyne Systems, here we come. All right, thank you all very, very much for your attention today, and I'll see you at the party.